Hello everyone. This is Yana Smakula for SimonsSaysStamp.com. Welcome back for another Yippee For Yana video. In this episode, I'm sharing a watercolor floral card that I made for my mom using some new and old products from Simon Says Stamp. Whenever I make cards for specific recipients in mind, I try to use the colors, the objects, the flowers that the recipient likes. I knew I was making a card for my mom, as I haven't seen her in a while, and I just wanted to cheer her up. She loves to garden, and clematis is one of the flowers that she has in her garden. And since I've never really made a card using this flower, I thought I would give it a go. Simon has this gorgeous Mom's Clematis stamp set available in their store. It's a large 6x8 stamp set with pretty flowers that are just begging to be colored. This stamp set also comes with a wonderful selection of sentiments that one can use on a card for a mom or any other important figure in their life. It has literally been ages since I last picked up my watercolor supplies and did some watercoloring. I'm always fascinated by Debby Hughes and her watercolor masterpieces, so I decided I would channel my inner Debby and try to watercolor this clematis. My watercolor skills are far from being the best, but it doesn't stop me from trying and practicing, and we all know that practice makes better. While I was chatting, I went ahead and stamped the images I had picked on watercolor paper. I'm using Arches cold-pressed watercolor paper, and I stamped images in VersaFine Onyx ink using my Mini Misty stamping tool. It is handy to stamp these using some sort of stamp positioner, as watercolor paper is usually textured and you do need to apply a fair amount of pressure to get good impressions on this type of paper. I also did some masking by stamping images on masking paper, cutting them out and applying them over the original to be able to stamp additional leaves and flower buds next to the main flower. I wasn't very careful about my masks, meaning I didn't really cut them out precisely or carefully, as I knew I'd be watercoloring this and there was no need to be very specific about the image lines. If any lines were missing, they could have been easily fixed with watercolor. Once my stamping was done, I moved on to coloring. I went with the easiest method for me, and that's using my Danielle Smith watercolors and a water brush. I do have some high-quality watercolor brushes that I love. They are sitting in my watercolor palette, and I often use them, especially the smallest detailed brush or the largest brush if I need to color some small details or if I need to watercolor a large area quickly. But for this image, I wanted to make it easy for myself, so I just used a water brush instead and only colored this piece using the water that was in the brush. No any other water was used. I opted to use purples for this project and used mostly imperial purple color from my palette. I colored one petal at a time. This is not something I typically have the patience to do, but this is the right way to go about it. And I also painted in layers, coming back to each of the petals as the previous layer of the color had dried and adding more color and more layers. The clematis is a beautiful flower, and this particular image has a lot of detail to it, and it really was a treat to color. I simply followed the details of the drawn image when selecting the shadows and highlights areas for my coloring. I also used green for the leaves, and this is Undersea Green, also from Danielle Smith. To add some color variation to this image, I later added a lot of shading using a different color, Shadow Violet, and I think that's what made all the difference and made this image more lifelike. My biggest takeaway from this project is patience. A good watercolor piece requires a lot of patience and layers. This is not something that I have, so I often struggle with having great watercolored results. I typically have the patience to do one, maybe 2 layers at most. I also decided I would do a simple watercolor wash in the background, and for this I used Undersea Green color. It's the same color I used for the leaves, and simply diluted it more to have a lighter, softer green around my clematis cluster. Next, I took this piece back to my Misty and stamped a sentiment for this card. It reads, "Mama, you are incredible in every way." It took me a few times to get a good black impression on this watercolor paper, and I'm really glad that I used my Misty to stamp it and not a regular clear block because I would have messed it up. At this point, I reached for my colored pencils. These are Polychromos by Faber-Castell, and I used them to define the flower center. I painted over some of the yellow stamen with purple watercolor, so now I simply went over the watercolor with a pencil and added the yellow over top. Now, it wasn't pure yellow, it wasn't as vibrant as I would have liked it to be. It would have looked better if I had masked the flower center with masking fluid, but the stamens were so tiny, I didn't really know if I could do it, so I just opted to color over them. Next, I also used a purple pencil and deepened the shadows on the petals, and I love doing this. Pencils are much easier to control than watercolor, and adding some darker areas to the flower petals was a very easy task. Next, I splattered some Hero Arts white iridescent shimmer over the entire image to give it more of a massy look. It helps to disguise any imperfections, and it just adds to the overall look and feel of the card. I love using this product for an effect like this. I left my watercolor piece overnight as I wasn't really sure how I can finish it. I liked it, but it felt like something was missing. The next morning, I decided to add simple stamping to the background, and this is where Simon's new Sketchy Lines background stamp came in. When you look at this stamp, it doesn't seem like much, but it actually is a fantastic one to add some nice details to your backgrounds. I created additional masks to mask the entire image cluster. I positioned the stamp over my image, I inked it up with Simon's Fossil ink, and stamped, adding some interest to my background. The masks protected my flowers and leaves and allowed the sketchy lines to be stamped on the background only. I also decided I wanted to add more purple to this card to tie it together with the flowers. So I white heat embossed a part of the sentiment on the purple cardstock. I first used regular embossing powder, but the font is so small, the regular embossing powder didn't really give me good results. So I repeated the heat embossing on the other side of the paper and then used white detail embossing powder this time. Because the powder is finer, it gave me a better, crisper result, and the sentiment was readable. To cut this strip, I originally cut it a bit too wide. I used my cut-align ruler and trimmed it down a little bit. I just received my cut-align in the mail, and it was actually my first time using it. I'd seen this tool at Creativation Show back in January, but I haven't had the chance to try it myself. I found that the ruler has a very nice thickness to it. In fact, it's much thicker than all of the other rulers I have at home. It's very sturdy and perfect for cutting thin paper strips like this. To put everything together, I created an A2 craft side folding card base. Next, I used a piece of fun foam to adhere my watercolor panel over it. I had trimmed it down using a die to give it a bit of interest around the edges. Finally, I foam mounted the skinny strip sentiment and embellished this card using several sequins in purple from the birthday cake sequin mix. I've already delivered this card to my mom and she loved it. I had enjoyed watercoloring this piece, and because of how not as difficult it was as I had thought it would be, I'm looking forward to watercoloring some more in the future. I hope you'll give this idea a try using these or maybe other stamps from your stash. If you do, remember to share online and tag us. We always love seeing what you guys are making. On the screen, there is a link to a playlist with all of my videos featuring Simon Says stamps. Subscribe now not to miss any new card making videos. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.